Our guest speaker tonight is Tom Dawkins. He is the co-founder of StartSomeGood. Tom has been committed to social change since he was kicked out of his English class, aged 16, a couple of years ago. As he left, he picked up a flyer advertising a student exchange to the United States. That flyer and the exchange changed his life forever. In the United States, Tom was asked to represent his peers at the United Nations World Leaders Summit. It was here that he realised the power of the individual in igniting social change and his own destination. Tom has founded several non-profits, including VibeWire. He was the first social media director at the global change-making organisation Ashoka before co-founding StartSomeGood. Tom's pioneering work in the non-profit space has been recognised with numerous accolades, including Innovator of the Year Award by the Nexus Summit and the Innovation Award at the Australia and New Zealand Internet Awards. To tell you more, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tom Dawkins.
It's so great to be here. Thank you so much for BBP and all the participating councils who've made this possible, and to all of you for turning up. And just before I begin, I'd like to also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Camaragal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, but also acknowledge the diversity of traditions that we have in the room, and pay my respect to all of your elders past and present as well. Some people grow up, I think, with a fairly clear sense of what it is they want to do and a real passion to pursue that calling. I was not one of those kids. I didn't know what I was going to do with myself growing up. I kind of meandered around. I didn't understand the connection between, effort I was supposed to be putting in high school and what that might lead to later on, or what I might do as a result of that. And the absence of that kind of sense of connection between my present-day efforts and future possibilities led to me not putting in much present-day effort. I remember in Year 9 I came 179th out of 180 kids at maths, and that was fairly typical for my results at the time. Now I went to a selective school, so they're all nominally bright, but so as I tell myself, someone had to come 179th, someone had to come 180th, any group of people. But obviously my parents were a little concerned and didn't know what to do with me. At the time I used to spend a lot of time here in the corridor, outside class, and so it was not so atypical that we find me there on the day mentioned, midway through Year 10, having just been kicked out of English class for talking again. And I was standing there in the corridor. This is not actually my school corridors, but similarly enough. Couldn't find a photo of a corridor of my actual school's corridors. I need to actually visit sometimes, sneak in, take a photo. That won't be weird at all. Reflecting on the injustice of the world and, things that needed to be better. And I noticed that there was a brochure that someone had dropped. And it literally was covered in muddy footprints and had been there for a little while, but I was so desperately bored to do something with my brain that I picked it up to have a read. And it was for a student exchange program to the US. And my mind was blown that such a thing even existed. I'd never heard of anything like that. I didn't know that kind of thing existed in the world, that you could, as a teenager, potentially pick up and move somewhere for up to a year on your own, without your parents or a school group or a chaperone or a teacher. And I knew immediately that was what I wanted to do. And I went home that night and announced to my parents, Mum and Dad, I'm going to go to America for a year. And they, in retrospect, somewhat suspiciously, agreed instantly that that was a really good idea and that I should definitely do that. So a year later, having upped my grades significantly because I had to, so finally having the kind of sense of short-term goal and something to work for that I'd been lacking, I'd got myself up into, only averagely hopeless, and that was sufficient to be allowed to go on the program. And so I found myself in Spokane. Does anyone here know where Spokane is? Washington State. A couple, that's pretty good actually. I have a map for the rest of you. So it's 300 miles east of Seattle. I didn't know where it was before they told me that's where I was going there. I was one of the kids who said, I don't mind where I go. I think a lot of kids are like, I want to be in New York or San Francisco. I was like, I just want to be somewhere else. Anyway, that's why here is good. And so I found myself there up near the Canadian border, experiencing pretty extreme colds for the first time. But importantly, experiencing what felt like myself for the first time. You know, once you strip away, I mean, as anyone who's ever moved to another country or perhaps even gone travelling for a long period of time on your own would be familiar with this sensation that you kind of strip all the normal stuff away. You take away your context and your family, and for me, you know, my school and my friendship groups and the kids who bullied me and all the stuff around me. And then I had the chance to kind of go, okay, so what's left now? And I think that's, you know, that's really the experience of growing up in a way, as you begin to identify what's you under all those layers. And so the whole experience would have been, you know, would have affected me profoundly no matter what happened. But it wasn't in Spokane that I had the specific kind of transformational experience I want to talk to you about. It was here in San Francisco. And that's because I was selected to attend the State of the World Forum. And this was one of a number of efforts at the time to kind of begin to articulate what is it that we're now aiming towards. And those efforts actually resulted eventually in the Millennial Development Goals because of the need to articulate a new set of objectives. So this was one of the early efforts around that. And it brought together Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan and who else am I trying to think about? Margaret Thatcher. That's actually, sorry, George Herbert Walker Bush in conversation with Kofi Annan. This is the only photo I have of it. Sorry it's so grainy. This is a scan of a photo I took with a disposable camera 20 years ago, or whatever it was. And I had this rather overwhelming experience of turning up fairly unprepared and being told that myself and the 31 other young people who were there, all of us between 15 and 17 from 28 different countries, were there to be the voice of 3 billion young people in the world. And my head kind of exploded at that idea. And I had the most extraordinary kind of experience over that week, meeting multiple Nobel Peace Prize winners, meeting Thich Nhat Hanh, the head of the Vietnamese Buddhists, meeting Gorbachev, and most importantly, meeting those other young people who were all extraordinary. And having this incredible sensation of all these kind of interesting, important, world-changing people stopping and listening to what we had to say and what I had to say. And so walking away from that, I had this very contradictory sensation. On the one hand, I felt deeply personally empowered myself. You know, I'd really had the experience, maybe for the first time, of feeling like my voice mattered. The experience of being told my voice mattered, of having people stop and listen and respect what I had to say. And honestly, I didn't know anything, obviously, about anything. And I really shouldn't have been there. And the more I thought about that, the more it occurred to me that that's what youth empowerment looks like, that I'd just been the recipient of a fairly common, well not common, but typical experience, which is that youth kind of leadership opportunities are tokenistic, haphazard and biased towards wealth. Because while the 32 of us had a seeming diversity, we came from 28 countries, we were black and white, boys and girls from the rich world and the poor world, every single one of us had parents who could afford to send us to America for a year, because all of us had been chosen, had been plucked out of the same exchange student organisation to attend the summit. They didn't have the time or the inclination to do like a global search for worthy young leaders. And so they did, you know, the sensible thing you do, you partner. But had they done that search, I wouldn't have heard about it. I don't know how anyone heard about anything, to be honest, back in '95. I mean, I didn't have an email account and my school wasn't prone to sharing those sorts of non-school opportunities, so I definitely wouldn't have heard about it. But if I had heard about it, I wouldn't have applied, because that clearly didn't sound like me. I'd never done anything. And had I applied, I wouldn't have been selected. There's surely other people out there who, you know, runs on the board and actually shown some sort of put some effort into making other people's lives better at some point. But what I was somewhat ready for the opportunity, because I grew up in a political family. And so our dinner table conversation, our culture was to argue about politics. And so when out of nowhere I was invited to write an essay about why I thought I should attend the State of the World Forum, I was ready to be like, yeah, I think I should go. And so reflecting on this, I thought, well, we have to do better. You know, we have to find a way to give not just the typical, you know, kind of outspoken, overly opinionated, upper middle class, political family, young person the opportunity to express themselves on the things they care about. We need to give that experience to everyone. And so pretty much ever since then, I've been trying to figure out ways to do that. I've been trying to build platforms that make it more common and more accessible for people to actually share their points of view and to have the experience I had of having it respected and listened to. And that took the shape of a number of not-for-profits, the third of which was an organisation called Viwire, which I led for 8 years, and it's the only of the three non-profits I set up by the time I finished uni. It's the one that's still alive today. It's 16 years old now. And so I led it for the first 8 years, and over the first 5 years of that, we did a whole bunch of really cool stuff. All of it oriented around how we get young people's voices out there. How we transmit them, so how we equip young people to be able to express themselves, give them the skills and the confidence to do that. Then how we carry their voices, and then how we force people in positions of power to listen to their voices. And so it took the form of a film festival that toured around the country with Dendy Cinemas, we released Interface magazine at the Writers' Festival, we had multiple websites that published different perspectives. And we did something, and we sent young people out on the campaign trail during the federal election. It was actually the first time I ever suited up while I was working for Vibe One. I went to Canberra, convinced that we needed to find a way to actually bring young people's perspectives into the federal election campaign, that it wasn't enough that we could read what was going on in the paper and then react to it, because what was in the paper didn't speak to the things that we cared about. No one was asking, how does this affect young people? And we thought we actually need to get people there who can ask the question. So I suited up and went to speak to and met with the press secretaries for both the Prime Minister and the opposition leader at the time, and told each of them that the other had already agreed to let us put our journalists on their bus, and wouldn't it be a shame if our youth reporters were only covering the other side's story during this election. And so they both then did agree, and we had 18-year-olds. You know that elite group of journalists that fly around with the leaders and are on their bus? We had 18-year-olds in that group sticking up their hands at press conferences saying, how does this affect uni students? How are we ever going to be able to afford to buy a house, and things like that. But after 5 years of doing that, and as proud as we were of the work we were doing, I began to think more and more about this troubling question, which hadn't really occurred to me until then, which was, what if we don't have all the best ideas? I know I was getting old. I no longer was confident that I knew everything. And I thought, well, what we're doing is in a way kind of a repetition of what happens before, which is that we're pre-creating these opportunities. We're like, are you a filmmaker? We have a film festival you can put a film in. Are you kind of journalistically inclined? We have a couple of cool opportunities for you. But we were pre-creating these opportunities, and people had to slot into those in order to take advantage. And we thought, well, there's probably all these cool ideas out there that won't even occur to us and stuff that needs doing. So how do we take a step back and not just create things that people can participate in, but how do we support them to create the things that they know are needed for their community? And so that led us to open what was then called Square One, and is the first co-working space in Australia, which is one of those weird things that seems much more innovative in retrospect than it felt at the time, because co-working's become such a fad, and to be able to say, the oldest continuously operating, the first kind of commercially run, sustainable co-working space, sounds super innovative. We were actually just trying to replicate what we had at campus, which was a room that all the kind of project nerds could go to and work together, while everyone else was hanging out on the library lawn, and which had computers and printers and scanners and laminators and fax machines back when you needed them. And we just wanted that once we graduated, because then after graduation, we all ended up back home and in cafes. And so we just set up kind of a version of what we'd already been experiencing, but off campus, but now voila, innovation. But this was a space that was for young social entrepreneurs under 26 to create projects that they knew were needed for their peers, for their communities. In 2008, I left Vibe One not really knowing what I was going to do with myself. I had that weird generalist skill set. I imagine lots of you have from setting stuff up. When you're running small businesses and you do bits of everything, and then you kind of maybe leave that and you're like, I don't quite fit into any job that's advertised. I don't have the depth of experience other people do in any one of these areas, marketing or HR or technology or any other bit and piece. And I was kind of fortunate at the timing, I guess, because 2008 was that moment when a lot of organisations had realised that they needed someone to do social media stuff, but they didn't actually know what that looked like in practice. And I came along having done a few interesting things, and they were like, fantastic, you should do this for us. And so I ended up at an organisation called Ashoka in Washington, DC. And Ashoka is a fascinating organisation because they literally invented the phrase social entrepreneur about 35 years ago to describe something that no one knew how to talk about at the time, which was people acting in highly entrepreneurial ways, focused on scale and sustainability, customer-centred design and things like that, back before we called it that. But in the pursuit of social change, not just private wealth. And Bill Drayton, the founder of Ashoka, who invented that phrase, is also famous for this quote, which I love, which is that he used to say, that old idea of give someone a fish, they'll eat for a day, teach someone to fish, they'll eat for a lifetime. He's like, we're not interested in either of those. We're looking for people who are restructuring the fishing industry, who are changing how fishing happens, not just teaching you to do it the way it's always been done or the way it's meant to be done today, but actually rethinking how this happens. And so I met my StartSomeGood co-founder at Ashoka, and we were very passionate about how do we support this group of innovators? How do we support people who are genuinely trying new things? Because we could see that the social sector, the traditional social sector, didn't know how to support innovation. You know, the traditional funders in the social sector are government and foundations and, you know, high net worth individuals mostly, and they all have this infuriating bias towards funding things they know will work, which sounds really sensible, but ends up with an ecosystem incapable of proving that new things work. Someone has to fund things we don't know will work in order that we can discover that they do work. But no one has been willing to take that work on or to take that risk traditionally in the social sector. So if you could imagine the commercial world where I later moved, I was living in San Francisco when I started StartSomeGood, it'd be a little bit like, if anyone has watched the show or is familiar with the contours of that world, there's a class of investors called angel investors who take high-risk bets on unproven companies, and then there's VCs who come in a little bit later. The social sector is like a world of all VCs and no angels. And most of the most disruptive, high-impact companies that we know and love today, or your mileage may vary vis-a-vis love, but have tended to be angel-funded. Because they don't sound sensible on day one. The stuff that can create the biggest impact sounds the most ridiculous. And so we set StartSomeGood up to help try and create a pool of risk-tolerant capital by breaking it down into smaller pieces, which was solving us, once again, not really as innovative as it could look. We were, you know, kind of copying Kickstarter, who we thought were solving a very similar problem for creative entrepreneurs, helping them go around the gatekeepers in their sector, the record label execs, the gallery owners, the National Endowment of the Arts. And we thought, well, we need the same thing. We need to offer the same opportunity to social entrepreneurs. And in a way, the type of entrepreneur that we've been working with and we are passionate about working with, and indeed the type of company that we ourselves represent, is new. The reason this phrase only got invented 35 years ago, social entrepreneurs, because until then people didn't think they needed it, because these things were kept fairly separate in people's minds. On the one hand, we have traditional business where you go to make a living, where you're focused on your personal outcomes and how best you can, you know, all your family outcomes, how you can support your family, the people closest to you. And then in the other quadrant, you have traditional non-profit, religious activities and so on, where we do stuff that is purely for welfare outcomes. But the kind of companies that we're working with today are in fact the next step beyond what Bill Drayton was seeing. There he was seeing people acting in business-like fashions while running social projects. Now we're seeing people who are creating social projects that are businesses. And so we're occupying this new quadrant where people are trying to do these things together. And so the old way of thinking about legacy, of thinking about giving back was literally, you know, you give back. After you've taken, you give back. And so that kind of career path or that mode of legacy is always, for me, best exemplified by this guy. Does anyone know who this is? This is Alfred Nobel. So it's his fortune that continues to fund the Nobel Peace Prize. Does anyone know how he made that fortune? Dynamite. He was the inventor of dynamite. And after being horrified by seeing what his invention had wrought, he felt bad about that. So in the latter part of his life, he founded the Nobel Peace Prize, and it's literally his face that we put on the medal that we give the world's greatest peacemakers, the inventor of dynamite. And that's kind of how it went. You know, you could do whatever you wanted up till 65, provided you did the right thing at the very end of your life. You know, you could, you know, loot and pillage in the way that the Rockefellers did and all the robber barons of America, but then you found a university or something and you're good. You know, or even on a smaller scale, you could do whatever you liked Monday to Saturday, but then you'd go to church on Sunday and say, I'm really sorry, and then you'd do it again, rinse and repeat. And of course, this is not what millennials are up for. You know, they're like famously impatient, and they're not willing to wait till Sunday, let alone wait till retirement to give back. They're looking for this, all of it together, all at once, right now. I want to make money, and I want to do something that I'm really passionate about, and I want that to be meaningful and positive for the world. And, you know, so millennials get a bad rap. People are like, they're so entitled, they're so, you know, impatient. But thank goodness they might be here just in time to save us all, because this is the kind of capitalism that we need to create. This is the kind of business world that we need to create if we're actually going to get through the challenges of the next century. And the impatience of this new generation, who I don't think are creating this. I think generations, people speak about generations as if they're kind of they exist in a vacuum and it's the quality of the generation that is creating the changes, when in fact generations are only ever reflecting changes in the wider society. You know, millennials didn't create a world where where they hop around. They grew up into a world where businesses no longer provided a guarantee of lifetime employment. And they did the logical thing you do in that world, which is you look around and do what's best for you. So it's always a reflection of what's going on, but they're an early warning system for what's travelling through the economy, of course, that already 50% of the people on the earth, and soon, of course, aging the rest of us out. And we see the evidence of this everywhere, this new orientation, this new impatience. In organisations like Escape the City, which began with 15 people meeting in a pub in London 5 years ago, and now has over 500,000 members around the world, all of them millennials looking for work that matters. In what they tell us, affects their beliefs around companies and their relationships with companies that make them more likely to work for them, to support them, and of course to consume from them. In why they leave jobs. This is a huge report from Deloitte just last year on why do millennials who take their first job, why do they leave that job? Everyone competes to get the best young staff out of university, and a lot of them, kind of churn out of the company that puts so much effort into recruiting them. Why is that? And overall, they said the number 2 reason that people leave their current workplace is a bad relationship with their boss, essentially, as manifests in feeling like there's a lack of professional development and other things, but fundamentally bad bosses drive people out of their workplaces. Second only to a lack of alignment around purpose and meaning with the company they work for. Now, if you guys have ever worked for a bad boss, I've had a bad boss, and it's like a daily agony, getting out of bed and going to work for someone who you don't respect and feel like doesn't respect you. And so if you can imagine, that's not me, no, I wasn't sure. So if you can imagine how quickly that can send you, make you start checking the jobs pages in the newspaper. Imagine the fact that the only thing that's sending people, the best young staff, out of their workplace quicker is a lack of alignment around purpose. And think about the cost that that represents to so many of these businesses. So in terms of like dollars and cents, it is costing real money right now that people spend on this. It's also in the entrepreneurs that we see today and their values, because all the world's most famous entrepreneurs today tend to be purpose-led. You may think that the purpose is misplaced or misguided, but Zuckerberg has a purpose to connect the world and make it easier for everyone to share. The founders of Google have a purpose to make all the world's information digestible and digitizable. Tony Hsieh set out to make Zappos the world's best customer service organisation. Blake Makovsky founded Tom's Shoes. I'm wearing Tom's Shoes, actually. Invented the buy one, give one model. We had a buy one, give one company out in the corridor, actually, with thongs, which is awesome. Or Elon Musk, who is literally trying to save us with companies like Tesla and Solar City, but is also planning a way for us to get to Mars in case it all goes wrong and we ruin the planet. But either way, every one of these entrepreneurs, and so many more like them, are deeply purpose-led now. All of them will tell you they're not just here to maximise their money, but of course, if you are the one who finds a way to digitise the world's information and make it searchable, you will tend to end up making a lot of money along the way in the pursuit of that goal. Now, social business has been around for a long time, of course, and often it looked a little bit like this. This is our local grocery store here that my family shop at Taste Organic. And so it would often look like this, a specialist shop with a curated group of products that you knew were done with, according to your ethics. And what we know is that that served about 15% of the population. About 15% of people, give or take how you measure this, are prepared to kind of go a little bit out of their way or pay a bit more to get products that are more in line with their values. But how we go beyond that and how we capture the other 85% looks more like this, which is a terrible photo of the eggshelves at Coles, but the fact that Coles no longer sell caged eggs is in some ways a more meaningful, a more dramatic change in ethical consumption patterns than the existence of specialist shops. And so it's the invasion of the mainstream shelves that is driving a lot of this, driven by consumers who are now actively trying to differentiate what is most ethical on those shelves. And that need to differentiate has led to the rise of new rating systems like B Corps. StartSomeGood is proudly a B Corp. And B Corp is a holistic rating system that goes beyond, fair trade. We've had fair trade and Rainforest Alliance for coffee and things like this. B Corp measures all of it. Who you buy your energy from, where you get, do you use recycled paper? It's a laborious process to get certified because you have to tell them everything, how much you pay your staff, your leave policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then if you end up with a sufficient score, you become a certified B Corp. The only reason this matters and the only reason companies are prepared to go through that laborious process is because consumers need the information, because they are looking to support these sorts of companies. And of course, for us at StartSomeGood, we're seeing heaps of really interesting social enterprises launched through our platform. From Good On You, which is also a ratings product that allows you to scan the barcode of clothes and tells you what their supply chain is like, so solving a similar sort of challenge for fashion consumers, to social enterprise food trucks, to Mighty Good Undies, the world's most ethical and comfortable, they say, but I can't vouch for that, underwear company. And all of this is consumers, of course, looking to align their everyday consumption with their values. Once again, not separating it out into something you do some of the time or some part of the week or some part of your life, but something that you do and live every day in all the decisions you make, who you work for, how you invest your money, what you buy. And I was struck by, I actually saw another example, more evidence just the other day, of have you guys seen how universities advertise themselves now? I don't know about you, but I feel like when I was graduating in the 90s, universities advertised themselves like 80% of our graduates get jobs within 3 years or something. Now have you seen how they advertise themselves? They're all about leadership for good, starts here. This is the most recent University of Sydney campaign. Clever Moore, back in the 70s. Or UNSW. Don't rest till you find your calling. No mention of jobs, employment, anything like that. It's about finding your calling. It's about figuring out who you are and the impact you want to have on the world. So this is the zeitgeist, but I don't think it's changing. I don't think it's a fad. I think it's a fundamental shift in our expectations for ourselves, and it's a benefit of prosperity. We can afford to focus on this more now, because as a society in Australia, we have mostly, not for all of us, and not sufficiently, and not comprehensively enough, but we have mostly dealt with the base of the pyramid issues for ourselves, and so we can begin to think about things like our calling. And so for a lot of people, I think they don't quite know what's going on. They see bits of this. It's a little bit like being a hiker lost in a strange, an unfamiliar mountain range. You can kind of see the lake of B Corps over there, and the Mount Social Enterprise, Mount free-range eggs over here, bits and pieces of this. You hear people talking about it, but it's really hard to see what's going on and what it matters big picture until you pull up. And it's only from 30,000 feet as we look down that we can really see what's going on, I think. And what we're seeing is really a fundamental rewiring or reimagining of what business means in our lives. Shifting from the classic 1970s idea that the only role of business, the only responsibility of business was to maximize profits for shareholders. And in fact, if you ask millennials now, only 7% of them agree with that. 93% think business has a greater role than that. From at least playing a limited role in not doing overtly destructive stuff, through to supporting causes, through to actually advocating, through to completely rewiring your business, that indeed the role of business is social change and profits follow from that, is already up to 23, 21%. And I think that's going to just keep shifting around that wheel until it's almost all in the red and the grey. And it's not just, of course, the fact that our values are shifting. It's that we live in a world where the way in which we express our values is shifting as well, which is what's accentuating and accelerating this existing trend. And so I often think that this is a little bit like, if anyone's seen the classic movie from the 90s, The Perfect Storm, when one storm front catches up with another storm front, that's what can create perfect storm conditions. And I think that's where we're at for social business. Because prosperity has given rise to a generation that is asking deeper questions and expecting more around what they want for their lives, for their careers, for the businesses that they found. And social technology has given us the ability to express that, explore that, reveal that, and advocate for that in new ways, which has taken it up to a whole new level. People have always said that word of mouth is the best marketing, but we didn't really act like that was true at any scale. As soon as people could afford it, they do TV ads and things like that, generally. Word of mouth was a nice idea. The best marketing, but it doesn't scale. Where, of course, now it's the best marketing that also does scale. And what we know works for social media marketing is not, in fact, hitting people over the head with messages we pay for, but crafting messages that our supporters, our consumers want to share for us. Marketing today is less brute force, is less sumo wrestling. That's probably underselling the tactics involved in sumo wrestling. I don't understand the sport very well. And more jiu-jitsu of how you use these tools in a very lightweight way, often with very small companies, can completely outcompete much, much larger ones because they inspire their users to actually share their message for them, to do their marketing for them. And in this world, social enterprises have a systemic advantage because everything they do is more interesting than non-social businesses. Everything they do is more trustworthy than non-social businesses. Everything they do is more timely than non-social businesses. So literally every message they send is more interesting, more sticky, and more shareable than any equivalent company. And I always think the best example of this is who gives a crap toilet paper. Because I don't know about you guys, but I have never in my entire life bought a roll of toilet paper from the supermarket, taken it home and thought to myself, I've got to share this. This would make a great photo. Never once. But the people who do think that really commonly are those who consume who gives a crap toilet paper. Now, their product's really nice to design and really cute and kind of shareable in that way, but it's more than that. It's the fact that sharing this says something about who you are. It says, I care about things beyond just toilet paper. You know, I care about how to help the world and I'm doing the right thing. Or sharing, you know, a bottle of water, another inherently boring product made interesting. Or shoes, well, shoes are probably not inherently boring. But regardless, Tom's shoes must be the most per capita shared shoes or photographed shoe in the world. And as Blake Mycoskie said in his autobiography, people don't buy products, they buy stories. And so social enterprises are selling a better story. A shoe is never just a shoe. It's an it's a statement about the kind of world you want to live in, the kind of values you have. And it's not just, you know, our consumption, it's our creation as well. That these tools are not just allowing us to identify companies we want to consume from, they're allowing us to start companies in new ways. Lowering the barriers of entry to doing the right thing by allowing people to start companies that will do the right thing if existing companies won't. When I started VibeWire, I was determined that it wouldn't just be a Sydney thing. I felt very strongly that it should be national, and really when I was thinking national, what I meant at the time was that we wanted people from Melbourne and not just Sydney. But how to do that at the time? 1999, how did you identify people who cared about the same stuff as you in a different place from you? It was actually really hard. We didn't have social media there. There were forums, but everyone was anonymous. You know, I used to participate in some early forums. I was Dragon Ball T. I didn't know where anyone else was. The reason people always used to say age, sex, and location as the first questions was because you didn't know, and there was no way of searching. You had to ask everyone one at a time. And so the only way that we could figure out how to find those people in Melbourne was to go to Melbourne. I used this nifty piece of technology to travel down to Melbourne overnight, spent a day in Melbourne sticking posters up at Monash, RMIT and Melbourne University, and then got the bus back up to Sydney and went back to university the next day, and that got me my first group of collaborators from another place. Compare that to the StartSomeGood team today, and this is a recent photo of our team that's tuning in from 10 cities in 5 countries. And it's extraordinary what we're able to achieve together at much lower levels of, you know, hassle and cost and expense. And it's not just the positive, of course, it's also that social technologies can reveal people who are BSing. That once you could get away with running the same ad campaign with completely different messaging in the US and the UK, but you just can't today. Because people are going to call you out on that. And if you try to harness these technologies but you don't have the right kind of relationship with your supporters, as say Victorian taxis did with their Your Taxis campaign when trying to fight off Uber, you know, it goes about as well as you would expect. You can't simply ask people to campaign for you if you don't have that relationship, if you're not that kind of company. You can't fake it anymore. So why does this matter? This matters because it's already making dollars and cents, because it's already changing the equation for a lot of companies, helping social companies recruit better people, keep them longer, make them work harder, do better work, acquire customers who do your marketing for you and help you acquire more customers. But these are all at the moment just tactical advantages. And I think the real shift's going to be in the new feature where these shifts to being systematic advantages as we begin to bring in, inevitably, new types of pricing regimes around pollution and other sorts of externalities of business in response to the climate crisis and other challenges of this century. And that's when these businesses will shift from having a nice tactical advantage to having an unbeatable systemic advantage. Just as we saw in the petrol price shock in the 70s, where the Japanese manufacturers who were already building more cost-efficient, more petrol-efficient cars swept the world. And the US manufacturers took 20 years to catch up, only as soon as gas got cheap again to instantly forget and go out of business again the next time the price of gas went up and needed to be bailed out by the government. Well, we're going to stop bailing out those companies, and the people who are set up to survive in a carbon-constrained world where we use less resources or we price them more appropriately are going to win. So for you guys, I think it's an exciting question and it's an exciting time because we are at a point where I think we can use business in a way that does do not only removes, you know, not just the absence of negative impacts, but actually businesses that create positive impacts, that leave the world better than they found it, while creating prosperity for those founders and the people who put the hard work into getting them there. And so I'm really hopeful, because I think business is the greatest, has been one of the most destructive things, but can be one of the most positive things in our society, represents the greatest source of human ingenuity and energy and capital anywhere. And so it's not just that we can use business to make the world better, but that we must. And that's, I think, the moment we're at. Thank you.